So how do we escape the Malthusian trap? Well, essentially through three ways. And we're going to talk about these over the next little bit. So one, food production. So simply, right, again, the history of humankind can be written as the history of the calorie. How do we have enough energy? And certainly up until the 20th century, right, most of energy came from food, came from biomass, right? And this is certainly true, like, until we developed or discovered or found out ways to use things like coal and fossil fuels, right? Most of it comes from plants. Okay. Second will be disease and public health. So again, deal with issues of food. Can we produce enough resources, produce enough food and distribute it as well? We'll see distribution will be extremely important, particularly as we get into the 20th century, right? The creation of both national and global food markets, right? So because as we know, food can spoil. Food so has a limited lifespan, right? Shelf life, right? Second one will be disease, right? The other big one, right, will be how do we control that second horseman of the apocalypse, right? And so the development of medicines, but also increasingly, and we're seeing this even in the response to COVID-19, right, is public health. How do we provide safe sanitary conditions for our food, for our living conditions, all of those other kinds of things. And then the last one will be, we'll talk a little bit about family planning and the kind of racial and gendered implications of some of that, right? Because certainly in terms of one of the readings for this week will be, China, the focus on China and its ability to kind of make that great leap since the 1970s towards an economic and political powerhouse in the world, right, has been through things like population control. And we know there's the one-child policy, but again, what are the implications of those kinds of things, right? Who's making sacrifices, right? Who does this have a greater impingement on, right? Who does it potentially affect more? Okay, so let's talk first and foremost about food. So really, I mean, before we can have an industrial revolution, we need to have an agricultural revolution. And until the 17th century, 80% of the world's economy was agriculture, subsistence agriculture. That means simply putting enough food in your bellies, in your family's bellies, in your society's bellies to be able to survive, right? And as we know, there could be a whole range of things, right, that would get in the way. Famines, crop failures, all of those other kinds of things, which then led to limits on the population. But most people basically worked to feed themselves and eventually clothe themselves and house themselves. But in the modern period, right, no more than about 25% of the population is engaged in agriculture. So how do we produce so much more food with so many fewer people? And again, this is particularly true in quote unquote developed countries like Europe and North America, right? But also South America. Look at Argentina, right? We're under, these are like, United States and Canada and Argentina have often been termed as the breadbasket of the world, right? For all the crops and cattle and all kinds of other things they send out to their own societies and out and across the world. But how do they do that with only 5% of the population engaged in agriculture? Okay, so part of this is, again, the discovery or the control of these kind of new world societies, particularly in North and South America, the replacement of indigenous populations, but also indigenous plants and animals and all kinds of other things. North America did not have large domesticable cattle, right? But as we know, right, pigs, sheep, cows, right, are now the staple, right? Before the arrival of European peoples, basically it was game, but none of that's domesticable. The only real domesticable sort of native or indigenous animal was turkeys, right? So, which, as we know, right, not the same as a cow, although it doesn't consume as much resources either. Okay, so part of this is is that replacement through the great dying off, through the, as I said last week, the intended or unintended genocidal policies that replaced indigenous populations with European and other populations, and then the use of that land then to feed Europe and then eventually the rest of the world, right? In the 20th century, so part of that is just simply bringing in more land, right? But when by the time we get to the 20th century, as we know, as the globe starts to fill up, a lot of that, particularly since 1950, 1960, has to do with crop yields, right? And the ways in which, again, in places like the United States, corn production, right, basically doubled over the 19th century from 2 tons an acre to 4 tons an acre. But since the 1960s, and then remained relatively steady throughout the rest of the 20th century, until we get to about 1960. And then all of a sudden, what we'll talk about is the Green Revolution. It went from 4 tons to 10 tons by the end of the century. So being able to produce more food on a same plot of land, and how do you do that, particularly year after year? And so we'll look at agricultural science and things like that, genetic modification of crops and plants and animals and things like that. Now, again, GMO foods are not necessarily modern or new, right? This has been happening. Human beings have been modifying food for generations, for eons, for millennia. The original stalks of corn grown in the Americas by Aztec and Incans and other indigenous peoples, right, was about the size of my pinky finger. Now, as we know down to today, right, a good cob of corn can be as big as my forearm. Now, that didn't just happen in the 20th century, right? So, okay. So again, agricultural science, right, and technology becomes important, particularly, and really not until the 20th century. And maybe again, that explains that sharp rise, right? Why this has occurred, particularly in the 20th century. But as we know, scientific developments, technological developments, they may look, right, incredible, right? Miracle crops, all of those other kinds of things, but they do have costs, okay? So the first the early agricultural revolution, certainly of a modern period. We're not going to go back to talk about Mesopotamia and all the rest of those kinds of things and the development of farming and that. Largely occurs in Britain. And this may be, and certainly historians and others have explained that maybe this is the reason why the Industrial Revolution occurs first in Britain. There needs to be an agricultural revolution. There needed to be an ability to feed populations that are now living in cities or not engaged in agriculture, to be able to feed themselves, to produce things, right? So how does this happen? So one might be things like the enclosure movement, which kicked out Scots and Welsh and other English tenant farmers and often sent them to the New World, where kind of by irony, right, they did the same thing to indigenous peoples, right, displaced them. But the idea then that you needed to have larger plots of land to both graze cattle or sheep or whatever else, but also grow crops, that it was more efficient to do so on larger plots of land than it was on smaller plots of land. The use of things like fallow to replace nutrients in the soil. First, these ideas that if you planted turnip and clover, it would replace lost nutrients, right? The ability to produce crops on the same plot of land over and over and over again is the reason why you shouldn't plant your tomatoes in the same spot every year, because they won't do as well. There may be diseases and other things in the soil, but they also may take too many nutrients out of the soil. So replacing lost nutrients, this has become, if you think about indigenous societies, they kind of already knew this, right? In terms of the 3 sisters, right? Corn, bean, and squash, right? The beans were an important nitrogen fixing, and nitrogen, as we'll see, is extremely important to plant production. They already kind of knew this, right? For centuries, for millennia. But also new crop and livestock varieties. And like I said, being able to grow healthier and bigger cows and chickens and all kinds of other things, but also crops that could be resistant to disease, that could grow in more northern climates like red fife wheat in Canada. All of this becomes important. And a lot of this is kind of trial and error, the same way that human beings have been doing over the last millennia to do this. The addition, like I said, of new lands, right? So Britain and Europe, there's been theories out there that Britain and Europe were able to industrialize first because they had access to land and resources elsewhere. They could ship out populations that were surplus populations, right? Sending out those Scottish crofters to Nova Scotia or to the United States, and so fewer mouths to feed, but also getting back in this, what we'll talk about later in this kind of Columbian exchange, all new kinds of products, potatoes, tomatoes, sugar, right? That could feed the caloric intake necessary for human beings and animals to be able to produce, particularly if we're talking about the 18th and 19th centuries. And then the creation, and again, this is where distribution becomes really important. And we'll talk about this in terms of famines. National markets, be able to distribute food so that it just doesn't happen in one place, right? You can have bumper crops in one place and the crops can fail in others. So how do you even out that distribution, right? So that it can grow. So this growth of, and then how does that happen, right? So addition of settler societies, we've seen that. Transportation becomes really important. And when we think about this down into the 19th and 20th centuries, canals, railroads, eventually planes, trains, automobiles, the ability to ship foods over long distances, to be able to feed larger societies, right? Refrigeration and preservatives. So we know, again, I said before, food has a limited shelf life. Food can go bad, and it's no good if it goes to waste. So how do you preserve food and get it to those markets? And so all of those things will become important. But globalization, again, part of the issue as well with diets, and we'll talk about this in a few slides as well, is the idea that, you know, for the most part of human history, people's diets were relatively mundane, were relatively small. So it wasn't just that they didn't have enough to eat, but they weren't necessarily always getting the right amounts of foods to eat, right? And again, part of this has to do with all of those other kinds of things. How do you move strawberries and oranges that can deal with scurvy, you know, out of places where they will grow into other areas of the world where they won't grow or won't grow at certain times of the year, right? So the modern supermarket, again, modern, the variety that's available to people is just unbelievable compared to previous centuries. And again, even there, the things like salt, things like sugar as a preservative. So sugar becomes really important, right? We don't think of this as a driver of world history or global history, but sugar becomes important because it allows you to preserve, to make preserves, to make jams and jellies and all kinds of other things. And so you can keep your strawberries for more than just the few weeks that they grow in the early summer. And then again, mechanization. But again, most of this won't happen to the 20th century. Rural electrification, all of those other kinds of things does not come to parts even in Canada and the United States till after World War II. So really, when we think about tractors and all of those other kinds of things that are going to be extremely important to harvesting, right? That doesn't really occur until the 20th century. Okay. And again, if we look at maybe parts of the globe where this is occurring, right? Chicago becomes the kind of food lot of the world in the by the mid 19th century, not only shipping out wheat from the American West as American settlers move on to the plains and start growing wheat and corn and a whole range of other things, right? So that becomes really, really important to feeding, you know, other areas of the globe, particularly Britain. Britain is not able to sustain its own population from its own domestic agricultural production until maybe probably about 20 or 30 years ago. It depended, and many other societies depended upon, the access to food resources in the rest of the world. And as it notes at the bottom here, but this is why British investors were so interested, right, in supporting things like American railroads, but also British capital was used to create huge plots of land in the American West to grow and graze cattle. So again, going to be something that's really, really important. And so there you see the Chicago Union stockyards. So before, when we think about this, you know, farmers largely produced for local markets, in large part because there wasn't a means of getting food to other areas before it could spoil, right? So, but developments in, you know, canals, railroads, eventually things like refrigerated railroad cars, preservatives, all those other kinds of things, made it possible, right, for cattle to be shipped from the West to Chicago, to be slaughtered, to be turned into pork, to be turned into steaks and hamburgers and all kinds of other things, or Cincinnati, or pork, for pork chops, and sausages and all those other kinds of things, right? So that becomes important. But obviously then the demand has to fulfill this, right? So there's not just supply, but enable to do this quickly, cheaply, and easily, right? And so, it's the assembly line, which we associate largely with the modern period. And, Henry Ford and the development of the Model T Ford actually starts in the packing houses in Chicago, right? And this is maybe down to today why packing houses are one of the most dangerous and brutal jobs out there, right? The rate at which cattle are slaughtered and turned into food has grown exponentially over this period. A lot of it is also being driven by the availability of labor who come into Chicago as the gateway to the West, and many of them, those immigrants, are not going on to farms in the Dakotas or elsewhere, but they're staying in Chicago to be able to work in those packing plants and produce that food. So increasingly, then people in New York and Atlanta and Los Angeles and Buffalo and all those other kinds of places are not buying local meat. They're buying meat that's produced or at least processed in Chicago and then being shipped out to the rest of the country and eventually, like I said, across the globe. And the United States is not just the only one. Argentina is doing that. This is the reason why it's a prime area of British investment during the 19th and early 20th century. So the American West becomes the food lot of the world, not just producing its bread, but also its the burger buns, but also the burgers themselves, right? And it's also subsidized to a large degree by the U.S. government. So it's not something you really see in kind of cowboy movies of the 1950s. Okay, so what else is going on here? So how does that happen? So again, as we move more and more people into cities, as the population grows, how does the land remain as productive so that fewer and fewer people can be involved in food production? So because the movement of people from the farm to the city creates a chemical balance in the countryside, largely because, right, excrement, right, crap, shit, doesn't get produced. And that's the primary way of replenishing things like nitrogen in soils up and until the 19th century. And so those virgin soils of the New World become exhausted. How do you continue and eventually, right, by the late 19th century, that you can't just sort of pick up your farm and move on to somewhere else where the soils are better, because as Frederick Jackson Turner, right, talked about last week, right, the frontier's ending, right? So you got to be able to make the plot of land that you own much more productive. Okay, so you can use traditional methods of fixing nitrogen by planting fallow or planting clover, but that takes land out of production, right? People are not eating. People don't really want to eat turnips and clover, right? They're not particularly, well, turnips are probably nutritious, but they don't pack a lot of calories, right? So the discovery then that things like bird guano that exists mainly on Pacific Islands and that could be used to produce nitrogen necessary for soils. And so you see this in particularly the United States, but other countries, right, racing out across the Pacific to these tiny little rocky outcrops, right? Like places like the Galapagos and Easter Island and all the rest of that and other smaller islands where they can collect bird guano and bat guano and use it to put on their soils that will be, right, that's high grade, standard, reliable fertilizer that will allow you to grow all of these crops, right? And again, this is slide notes, right, becomes the first real act of the United States moving out into the rest of the world. What you want to call that expansion or US imperialism is the Guano Islands Act, which authorized the US Navy and others to allow it to take peaceable possession of uninhabitable islands. Okay. Oops. So nitrogen becomes really important. And nitrogen is not even discovered until as an element, right, until just before 1800. Nitrogen as a nutrient, right, for soils and for peoples becomes really important by the 1850s. Biological fixation, and then what becomes known as the Haber-Bosch process becomes really important because guano is going to run out. And it does start to run out by the 20th century. There's fewer and fewer of these islands and everyone's capturing them and it's all being used up. So you got to find a way of producing nitrogen to be able to enable soils to remain as productive. And so two German scientists during the First World War, because it happens in Germany largely because Germany's blockaded. It needs to grow food for it to support its wartime production at home, and it needs to support its soldiers. So it's got to find a way to be able to make that land productive. And so two scientists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, invent what becomes known as the Haber-Bosch process. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but essentially it finds a way to fix atmospheric nitrogen, which exists in the atmosphere, and turn it into fertilizer. It requires heavy use of fossil fuels, though. And so this is why people say if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, one of the biggest ways you could do so is to change your diet, right? Because fossil fuel industry, not just in transporting things, is really important to the agricultural industry, but largely because of the necessity, particularly in the modern period, of modern fertilizers to make sure that crops can be grown on the same plot of land year after year after year and have the same or higher yields. And so people have noted, historians and others have noted, that without the Fitz-Haber process, the Earth could only sustain 2.5 billion people. So we're already 3 times beyond that. Right? Okay. The historical irony about this is Haber is also involved in the chemical industry, right? Which becomes a major industry in the 20th century. The gas that's used in places like Ypres against Canadian soldiers in World War I, chlorine gases, but also Zyklon B, which as we know are used in the Nazi death camps in World War II. And in fact, the other irony about all of this is that Haber was Jewish. Okay, so the ways in which inventions and all kinds of other things can be used in ways that escape the scientists and others who create them. Okay. But as we know over this period, there's still famines. There'll be important famines in India in the 1850s and 1870s. There'll be the Irish potato famine, which, as you know, which drives a lot of Irish immigration to Canada and the United States. That happens in 1849. We have the Holodomor and the Great Leap Forward in Soviet Russia and communist China in the 20th century that caused huge famines. We can think about what happens in places like Ethiopia and Somalia and Africa, again, of famines, right? But the important part about this, and it goes back to not just production, but it goes back to distribution. And again, up until the modern period, it was a belief, right, that famines were simply caused by crop failures and a whole range of other things, just about food availability, right? And that's just the normal way of the world. Again, going back to Malthus. Indian economist, modern Indian economist, Amartya Sen, though, poses a different hypothesis. He says, famine largely occurs where there's political failure. Britain, Great Britain, or England could have supplied food to Northern Ireland, and it chose, or to Ireland during the Great Potato Famine, and it chose not to. Same thing happens in India. In many places, such as the Holodomor and the Great Leap Forward, we know that these are disastrous policies of collectivization of agriculture, the move towards industrialization that were created by communist regimes that had tremendous impact on those populations, devastating in many ways, and probably retarded things like China's economic progress by decades. We also know that, again, food can be used as a weapon of war in places like Somalia, right, to divert food to particular populations. Ethiopia, it's still happening around the world, and the use even of diverting food aid and things like that to your own warring faction, right? Food as a weapon of diplomacy. PL 480 is an American act that decided that, you know, one of the sort of ways that the United States could influence global developments elsewhere, right, was to take the surplus. And again, here's where government intervention and government subsidization of agriculture will become a kind of a big issue, right? So American farmers are paid to produce and produce and produce and produce, but what happens to their surplus? Well, the government will buy it and distribute it in the rest of the world as a means of showing America's great benevolence. Canada and other nations very much do the same thing. So Sen really notes that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy, where people have a right to say, and you can see this, right? Either colonies, right? Very few, if at all, in what might be called a fully functioning democracy. And again, we can see the distribution here as well. Some in Europe caused by conflict, but also by political regimes in Soviet Russia, but largely in Asia and Africa. So again, we may want to think about terms of race as well. Okay. The last kind of sort of agricultural revolution that really occurs, so we have the kind of early one in England, we have probably one around the late 19th and early 20th century, in which we see the kind of industrialization of food production. But the big one then becomes what's called the Green Revolution of the 1940s to 1970s. And it's led largely by science in the quote unquote Western world. And it's the extensive use of science to develop crop varieties that can produce higher yields. So miracle rice, all these other kinds of things to ensure, again, that crops would be more resistant to disease, more resistant to drought, would produce higher yields. Now, it's partially about solving hunger, but it's also about preventing the spread of social and political unrest, and it doesn't necessarily always do so. The motivation was also among people like Norman Borlaug and others was to make developing nations more quote unquote food self-sufficient, right? If England was a country that could produce food for itself or get food for itself, and it became an industrialized country and a quote unquote modern country, the same thing would have to happen to underdeveloped or underdeveloped economies. Now, we know that this is not necessarily entirely true. Many of those nations remain unable to supply the basic food needs of their population. Okay. Second, it ties them into the global economy, and this is not always entirely good because, again, what are they producing? Are they producing cash crops like bananas and coffee, or are they producing things for their own society to be able to feed themselves? And in many cases, this green revolution has been used by countries and corporations and all kinds of other things to tie them into these forms of dependency, right? The Green Revolution also was not just about producing miracle seeds, but again, it required things like fertilizers, irrigation, so huge dam projects, which will have a tremendous impact on the landscape, pesticides, mechanization, right? All of these things were then necessary, right? You couldn't just plant miracle seeds and have rice grow. You had to do all of the other things along with it. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the same results. And so we see the rise then of large corporate agricultural entities. We can think about Monsanto, right? And Monsanto seeds, you have to use Monsanto seeds, and you have to use Monsanto fertilizer, and you have to use Monsanto pesticides, and you have to use a particular way of harvesting it. And one of the biggest issues in the agriculture industry is things like the right to repair, the right to save seeds, or all of those other kinds of things. So you're tied into that, and this is true not only in the developing world but also in the developed world, right? So and then what are the race, class, and gender implications of this? And I'll talk just briefly about the gender implications. Is that in many societies across the world, particularly African societies, women were primarily farmers. They were the ones who were responsible for a large part of food production, not men. But if you see the picture here, right, it's men in that picture, right? And so many of these ideas about creating a kind of modern agricultural economy was to shift production from women to men. And this has had tremendous cultural and other effects. In fact, some have claimed that in leaving women out of the process, right, has actually been an important reason why some of those societies have not been able to become more agriculturally self-sufficient or food self-sufficient.